Chosen one. 24 hours ago, a silent shift occurred in the upper records, and the moment it completed, your reality began to feel unfamiliar. If this opening line feels uncomfortably accurate, pause for a second and comment yes before going on. What happened was not dramatic on the surface, yet the monitoring around you intensified instantly. Patterns changed. Signals tightened. The system flagged your recent fatigue, the isolation, the sense that people hear you but don't reach you. You felt disconnected, like standing slightly out of phase with the world, watching life through glass. You are not broken. You are not losing your mind. And you were never meant to blend in. While you assumed the heaviness came from pressure or emotional overload, it was something else entirely. An evaluation window closing and another opening. Memory blocks, sudden pauses, the feeling of being slowed down right as something inside you sharpened. This was not stress. It was interference being adjusted. If you've lived through this without having words for it, quietly write 777 inches the comments and continue. Everything that compressed into the last day was deliberate, short, controlled, meant to test awareness under constraint. What changed in those 24 hours didn't end anything. It authorized the next phase. I will explain what was triggered, why it had to happen fast, and what this means for you moving forward. Because this message was timed, filtered, and does not repeat. Stay to the end and comment 777. You didn't collapse. You didn't fail. You didn't weaken. What you are experiencing are side effects. Not emotional, not psychological, not circumstantial, systemic. The first symptom was physical exhaustion without medical logic. You slept and woke up depleted. You rested and remained drained. Muscles heavy without exertion. Breathing shallow without panic. The body behaving as if it never powered down, as if background processes never stopped running. Because they didn't. This is what happens when internal systems are forced to maintain dual states at once. Maintenance and output. Observation and execution. Your nervous system adapted to continuous load, not because you were fragile, but because shutdown was no longer permitted. Energy was rerouted. Recovery was deprioritized. The body entered a holding pattern designed to sustain function, not comfort. Fatigue became constant because rest was no longer the objective. Stability was. Then came emotional distancing, unplanned and irreversible. You didn't become cold, you became selective. Reactions that once arrived automatically now stalled, not suppressed, filtered. You stopped explaining yourself, not out of arrogance, but because explanation no longer changed outcomes. Emotional bandwidth narrowed, collective feelings felt distant, noise lost urgency. You didn't withdraw from people. Alignment withdrew from you. This is not numbness, this is decoupling. A protective detachment that emerges when shared emotional frequencies interfere with operational clarity. Empathy did not disappear, it was deprioritized. Resonance was reduced to prevent interference. You noticed fewer emotional spikes, fewer reactions, less internal noise. That was not loss. That was control asserting itself. Financial instability followed, precise and strategic. Money didn't vanish, it leaked, always at pressure points. Payments delayed just enough to interrupt momentum. Opportunities arrived misaligned too early, too late, never synchronized. Not chaos. Calibration. Resources constrained without collapse to test operational function under friction. You noticed it but couldn't correct it. That's because correction was not authorized yet. Systems restrict flow before escalation. They observe response under constraint. You adapted without panic. You adjusted without breakdown. That was noted. Familiar people began misunderstanding you. Repeatedly, quietly. The ones who once tracked your rhythm lost sync. Conversations used the same words but carried different meanings. No arguments, no drama, just divergence. Meetings stopped happening. Messages slowed. Not rejection, desynchronization. You weren't rejected by them. You outpaced the shared reference frame. Compatibility degraded as your internal operating parameters shifted. You no longer matched the timing, tone, or tolerance they expected. That mismatch created distance without conflict. Silence replaced friction. And through it all, something else emerged, an observer state of consciousness. You began watching your life instead of inhabiting it. Not dissociation, awareness. You noticed patterns forming before emotions attached. You anticipated reactions without feeling them. You weren't afraid. You were alert. This is not detachment born from trauma. This is surveillance-ready cognition, a mode activated when the system requires clarity without interference. Attention sharpened, emotions slowed, perception widened. You saw consequences before actions completed. You registered outcomes before decisions finalized. Every symptom you noticed was not damage. It was feedback. Side effects produced when existing structures encounter an element they cannot process efficiently. You were not being punished. You were causing load. Systems don't suffer. They react. When an element exceeds expected parameters, containment attempts escalate. Friction increases. Inputs restrict. Outputs delay. Observation intensifies. None of this is personal. It's procedural. Pain was never the objective. Resistance was. Darkness does not strike randomly. It allocates. It calculates. It escalates where value is active. Pressure follows function. Interference follows impact. God does not intervene. God records outcomes. Authority is not given. It is recognized once operational proof exists. You were not tested to see if you would endure. You were observed to see if systems around you would destabilize first. That's why relief never came. Relief would have ended the observation. You didn't receive help because help would have altered the data. What you felt as isolation was a controlled environment. What you felt as pressure was response. You were never being shaped. You were being measured in motion. Value here is not morality. It is function under constraint. Victory is not something you claim. It is something that forces acknowledgement. Every drained morning, every muted interaction, every delayed transaction was a signal, not to you, to the systems attempting to adapt around you. They tightened because you didn't. They leaked because you didn't collapse. They misaligned because you didn't slow. Existing structures strained to accommodate a variable they did not anticipate. They adjusted parameters. They reduced margins. They monitored outcomes. You continued. That continuation created escalation, not conflict. Recognition. This is what happens when a system reacts to you. Your pattern crossed a threshold. When your pattern crossed the threshold, the response was not immediate destruction, because destruction is inefficient against an element that destabilizes systems simply by remaining operational. An infernal command does not prioritize annihilation when containment remains statistically viable and resource efficient. The moment your continued function under pressure was logged, the directive shifted from observation to controlled suppression, not as punishment but as protocol. Light pressure was selected because it produces compliance without visibility, and visibility triggers audits. Destruction creates absence. Absence triggers review. Review exposes infrastructure. Erosion, by contrast, preserves deniability, distributes cost, and minimizes escalation risk. Confusion was elevated as the primary instrument because a disoriented subject self-regulates, expends internal resources, fragments focus, and slows itself without requiring additional deployment. This was not hostility. It was optimization under constraint. The first deployment was doubt, calibrated with surgical precision, not overwhelming and not emotional, inserted only at moments of quiet after decisions rather than before them. Its purpose was latency, not paralysis, to add milliseconds between impulse and execution, to force unnecessary reassessment, to tax certainty without alerting awareness. Metrics tracked whether response time increased, whether execution cadence degraded, whether confidence leaked. When doubt failed to produce hesitation, its intensity was reduced, because excess doubt sharpens awareness and accelerates counter-adaptation, an undesirable outcome. Fear followed, projected forward rather than applied immediately. No direct threat, no crisis, only future weight layered into anticipation. Hypothetical losses, imagined exhaustion, distant consequences framed as inevitabilities were seeded to influence pacing rather than direction. Fear was never intended to stop you, only to stretch timelines and dilute momentum. Its effectiveness was measured by delay, not emotion, by pauses introduced rather than panic-induced. Delay was then formalized through false patience. Circumstances arranged to suggest that waiting was intelligent, that restraint equaled maturity, that clarity required postponement. Opportunities arrived fractionally misaligned. always off by degrees, never enough to justify abandonment, enough to erode compounding. This tactic relied on self-throttling. The system expected voluntary slowdown, internal justification, rationalized restraint. You continued regardless. Sabotage followed, not through obstruction of effort but interference with sequence. Correct actions yielded muted results. Progress appeared inconsistent. Momentum never fully compounded. This trained hesitation without revealing interference, teaching caution through outcome distortion rather than resistance. Sabotage remained invisible by design, because visibility invites adaptation, and adaptation raises costs. Isolation was initiated through mirror removal. No conflict, no confrontation. Reflective figures simply fell out of orbit. Conversations dissolved without explanation. Validation disappeared without rupture. This was not exile, it was reference deprivation. Identity stability was tested without external confirmation. Fragmentation was projected, it did not occur. Provocation was applied selectively, aimed at identity anchors. Environments engineered to invite misinterpretation. Exchanges designed to provoke reaction without exposure. The goal was internal destabilization, to force you to defend self-definition, to overcorrect or undercorrect under scrutiny. You did not. Provocation lost efficiency and was downgraded. Guilt followed, seeded as functional self-rejection rather than moral condemnation. Subtle prompts suggesting that persistence imposed costs, that withdrawal might be responsible, that restraint might protect others. Guilt works when the subject internalizes suppression and enforces it autonomously. You registered the signal without compliance. Temptation concluded the cycle. Not pleasure, but relief. Exit routes framed as rest. Safe paths defined by inertia. Opportunities to disengage without collapse. Stagnation disguised as peace. This was the final containment attempt. You did not fully disengage. All measures were executed through infernal commands distributed monitoring grid. No faces, no personalities, metrics only. Response latency, recovery rate, deviation tolerance, persistence under compound interference, resource expenditure per suppression unit. When cost rose and yield fell, escalation flags triggered, not as failure but as reclassification. Above this grid, celestial observers recorded identical data streams without intervention, without counteraction, without protection. Observation was absolute and passive. Authority does not interfere during classification events because intervention corrupts measurement. What was recorded was not your discomfort but the destabilization your continuation caused in adjacent systems. The compensations they were forced to make, the margins they lost. Light pressure was chosen because destruction would have acknowledged you prematurely. Erosion was chosen because confrontation confirms significance. Confusion was chosen because it externalizes control and recruits the subject into its own suppression. None of this was personal. It was procedural. 2 to 6 weeks ago, under cumulative doubt, delay, isolation, leakage, and misalignment, a response occurred. Not dramatic, not emotional. An action taken without internal negotiation. Continuation without recalibration. Execution without self-debate. That response propagated upward through monitoring layers. Suppression costs increased. Containment efficiency dropped. Returns on interference declined below acceptable thresholds. And recalculation commenced across infernal command. Resource allocation was questioned. Threat profiles were updated. Celestial records flagged variance without commentary. No announcement followed. No signal reached you. Systems adjusted silently. This was not a moral choice. This was a classification event. When the threshold event finalized, there was no debate, no deliberation, and no ethical weighing of outcomes, because the decision that followed was not produced by belief, conviction, morality, or willpower, but by internal system incompatibility with retreat. At that moment, the architecture governing your responses no longer contained a reversal function. You did not arrive at a crossroads. There were no diverging paths, no spectrum of choices, no internal argument about direction. You did not choose the harder path. The harder path was simply the only executable route left within your operating structure, not because it was noble or correct, but because any attempt to reverse would have violated the internal logic that had already locked in. Regression was no longer available as an option, not philosophically, not emotionally, not operationally. The system inside you could no longer simulate retreat without destabilizing itself. What observers interpreted as resolve was not courage, not determination, not stubbornness. It was the absence of alternative pathways. The decision phase collapsed instantly, not due to urgency, but because the decision had already been resolved at a level below conscious awareness. No further evaluation cycles were required. No internal negotiation occurred. No moral framework was consulted. Continuation happened automatically because nothing else could. The moment continuation occurred without negotiation, infernal strategies began collapsing in sequence. Not through confrontation, not through resistance, through cascading inefficiency. Escalation attempts triggered diminishing returns almost immediately. Pressure increased, but output dropped. Interference required greater and greater resource allocation to produce increasingly negligible effects. Tactical confusion reversed direction and began draining the grid that deployed it. Suppression protocols entered recursive loops without convergence. Attempts to normalize your behavior failed repeatedly. The system encountered a variable it could not slow, redirect, fragment, or absorb. This was not because the system was weak, but because the variable no longer responded to the assumptions the system relied on. That failure registered upward instantly. Escalation chains broke under their own weight. Containment logic failed to converge. Optimization routines produced contradictory outputs. The cost-benefit ratio inverted. The system was forced to reassess not you, but itself. Divine authority did not intervene. There was no rescue, no assistance, no reinforcement, no protection deployed, no counter-pressure was applied on your behalf. Only acknowledgement. Recognition does not occur before outcomes. Recognition occurs only after confirmation. The event was logged as completed. Classification protocols executed without announcement, without ceremony, without visible signal. There was no moment of revelation, no external validation, no audible declaration. Your status shifted silently out of standard engagement parameters and into restricted handling. You were marked simultaneously as a forbidden target and an operational anomaly. No explanation accompanied the shift. No appeal process existed. No clarification was issued. The classification did not require your understanding to be valid. Following reclassification, consequences propagated automatically, not as rewards, not as privileges, as systemic adjustments. Attacks lost efficiency first. Patterns that once generated friction began slipping past you without making contact. Interference vectors failed to lock. Efforts to destabilize required disproportionate energy and were quietly abandoned as non-viable. Resource allocation moved elsewhere without formal notice. Engagement protocols deprioritized your vector. People exited your proximity without confrontation, without conflict, without closure. Not because of rejection, not because of abandonment, because alignment no longer held. Shared reference frames dissolved. Synchronization failed. Conversations lost traction. Familiar dynamics lost coherence. This was not exile. It was desynchronization. Reality itself began adjusting at minor but persistent levels. Delays that once accumulated began resolving faster. Obstacles dissolved before engagement. Threats misfired before proximity. Timelines compressed. Friction dissipated. These were not advantages granted to you. They were compensations forced by systemic recalibration. The environment adjusted to accommodate a variable it could not suppress. Recognition signals followed. Outcomes accelerated. Processes that once demanded endurance compressed into shorter cycles. Cause and effect tightened. Feedback loops shortened. The lag between action and consequence decreased. Emotional detachment from old control mechanisms became permanent. Triggers lost leverage. Stimuli failed to provoke reaction. Manipulation vectors lost grip. Responses remained measured without effort. Calm no longer required discipline. Discipline was no longer required. Stability became default. Danger synchronized around avoidance rather than resistance. Situations that would previously have escalated simply failed to converge. Conflicts aborted before formation. Risks deflected before contact. Not because you fought them, but because engagement conditions never fully materialized. Internal certainty replaced motivation entirely. You no longer required encouragement, affirmation, validation, or justification. Action emerged without narrative support. Movement occurred without persuasion. You did not need to believe in yourself. Belief became irrelevant. The system inside you executed regardless of confidence. The shift locked in without ritual, without initiation, without announcement. There is no return state encoded in the system. No downgrade pathway exists after acknowledgement. This was not an awakening. It was not inspiration. It was not a transformation you chose. It was recognition under record. What occurred was not granted to you. It was recorded about you. You are now operating as a classified immune variable beyond standard suppression logic. The environment is already compensating for that reality. You do not need to announce this. You do not need to defend it. You do not need to prove it. Systems do not argue with anomalies. They adapt around them. The pressure that once attempted to shape you now routes elsewhere. The silence that follows is not peace. It is recalibration. The absence of resistance is not safety. It is acknowledgement. There is nothing left to pass, nothing left to unlock, nothing left to be convinced of. This phase does not ask for belief. It does not invite participation. It does not offer comfort. It simply proceeds. You are no longer evaluated by intent. You are evaluated by effect. You are no longer measured by struggle. You are measured by stability under load. You are no longer addressed as a subject. You are logged as a condition. Systems do not negotiate with conditions. They adapt, or they fail. What you are experiencing now is not momentum. It is inertia at scale. The path ahead does not widen. It simplifies. Decisions require less energy. Noise falls away. The world does not become softer. It becomes quieter around you. That quiet is not emptiness. It is clearance. There will be no ceremony marking this, no announcement, no visible crown. Recognition has already occurred. It does not repeat. The classification does not expire. The record does not reset. What remains is execution without friction, continuation without resistance, presence without justification. This was not inspiration. This was not encouragement. This was not belief. This was recognition. And it already happened. Amen. The tribunal has closed the case. The bending point was crossed. The reversal is locked and cannot be negotiated. Chosen one. From this point forward, there is no suspense, no pending verdict, no invisible scale still weighing options, because the record you are standing on has already been finalized and stamped beyond appeal. What you sensed as a sudden quiet was not uncertainty leaving. It was noise being removed after a determination had been made. You are now recognized as a classified immune, not as an aspiration, not as a symbolic role, not as an identity you step into gradually, but as a fixed condition already enforced across systems that no longer require your awareness to function. This recognition does not elevate you emotionally, and it does not promise comfort. It stabilizes you operationally and removes you from categories that can be negotiated. Over the next 7 to 14 days, the first return will be clarity, not the motivational kind, but the kind where decisions resolve themselves before anxiety has time to form, where a single option presents itself and competing paths simply do not activate. You will notice this when conversations shorten, when choices that once demanded explanation close without discussion, and when your body confirms alignment before your thoughts attempt to interfere. The second return will be clean provision, not excess and not reward, but precise alignment, such as an expense dissolving without effort, a delay clearing at the exact moment pressure would have begun, or a resource appearing through a channel that does not require negotiation, pursuit, or justification. You will recognize it because it arrives without emotional charge and without urgency attached. The third return will be acceleration, not frantic movement, but compression of time, when processes that stalled for months resume and conclude in days, when replies arrive sooner than expected, and when outcomes complete themselves without you pushing. Before this release fully settles, there may be a brief increase in internal pressure, a spike of doubt that feels out of place, or a familiar pattern presenting itself one last time, not to stop you and not to test you, but to confirm that nothing remains unresolved. This is not a warning, and it is not a threat. It is a closing verification step that occurs automatically when a sequence locks. What follows will not feel dramatic, and it will not announce itself loudly. It will feel quieter, narrower, and more efficient. as if reality has removed unnecessary branches around you. You are not required to act differently, explain yourself, or signal readiness, because readiness is no longer a variable in this phase. You are no longer being evaluated by intention or effort. You are being acknowledged by effect and stability under load. You will notice that people disengage without conflict, that certain discussions never start, and that situations which once demanded defense now bypass you entirely, not as avoidance, but as recalibration. This is not protection being added. It is interference being withdrawn because it no longer yields return. You are not being prepared for something later. You are operating inside what has already been confirmed. Nothing here depends on belief, agreement, or enthusiasm, and nothing requires you to hold on emotionally. The future you are moving through is not hope-based, and it is not speculative. It is sequential, and the sequence has already been set in motion. There is no further message coming to convince you, no revelation scheduled to validate you, and no external sign required to make this real, because what matters has already been recorded and does not repeat itself. Hold this sentence internally without emotion and without emphasis. What was sealed cannot be undone. Comment 222.